I just want to jump in and say, if you are attending this event having not yet seen an in real life copy of A Room Made of Leaves by Kate Grenville, it is one of the most beautiful objects, as well as being a phenomenal read. And you will not regret making a purchase. Thank you so much for joining us this Tuesday evening, Kate. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you all. And I would also like to, I'm actually in Jermy, Melbourne, which I would like to acknowledge is the land of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders and pay my respects to them.
Wonderful. I want to start right back at the beginning, a very good place to start. I'm always fascinated to hear how writers, especially writers as prolific as yourself, I can only imagine that at any given time there are a million ideas that you would like to explore, but I'm always so fascinated to hear how one sort of takes hold, how it condenses, and what the catalyst is for deciding to plunge into a book. So right at the beginning, how and why.
Because a lot of us learned about Elizabeth Macarthur at school, and she was only the wife of John Macarthur, the great sheep mogul. And she was described as a kind of devoted helpmeet wife. So pretty boring, frankly. So I didn't think twice about her until I started doing research for The Secret River, which would have been in about 2000. And in my deep background research, I came across some letters that she'd written. And by then I knew a bit about John Macarthur, her husband, who was a terrible man, a ruthless bully, a kind of almost Trumpian man of extraordinary difficulty. So I read a few extracts from her letters, which were very bland, rather dull, very kind of a bit pious, the devoted wife. Everything was hunky-dory in the letters. But now that I knew about John Macarthur, I thought her life can't possibly have been as hunky-dory as the letters make out. And I thought, okay, there's a gap here between what the letters say and what the reality must have been. And it's in a gap like that I'm always interested to sort of insinuate myself. I always write a book out of a question, never an answer. So my question was, what was the reality of Elizabeth Macarthur's life? And why did she feel the need to write these very goody-gumbo letters when her life was almost certainly something different?
Mm. You're a writer of both fiction and non-fiction, though, and I had the real pleasure of interviewing Michelle Scott Tucker about her biography of Elizabeth Macarthur when it had recently come out last year. What was the process I mean, I can understand that Elizabeth was of interest. Why fictionalize?
Because I was writing into a gap. I mean, I had done, back in 2000, I did do quite a lot of research about Elizabeth Macarthur, and I knew that eventually I would write a book about her. Mm. It's only taken me 20 years. But I knew that, like a lot of stories, it can only be told in fiction because, well, first of all, not enough is known about the reality of who Elizabeth Macarthur really was. Mm. You know, Michelle did a great job in that biography, but she's working with very sketchy materials, let's put it that way. And the other thing, of course, is that as I thought more about the book, I realised that my real subject was Elizabeth Macarthur, but it was also a bigger subject, and that was why we tell stories and how much we should believe them. What is the function of stories in our culture? And, you know, we live in a world that we're kind of saturated in stories and information and misinformation. And I began to think, if her letters left behind this kind of, I think, fairly false idea of what her life was like and who she was, I can use that as a way to talk about something which is actually about today. This is not just a book about a historical woman. It's actually a book about an idea, and that idea is hugely relevant today. Mm. For many years, for most of the writing of the book, it was actually called Do Not Believe Too Quickly, and that's still a kind of strapline to the book. And, you know, in this day and age, I would like to see every computer screen with that phrase engraved across the top, do not believe too quickly. So that's my real subject, and that's why it had to be fiction for all those reasons. The book is, in fact, it pretends to be non-fiction, of course. It pretends to be the memoir, the long-lost hidden memoir of Elizabeth Macarthur, where she spilled the beans about what her life really was like. So I've set up this framework where I say, look, I'm just the editor and transcriber of this amazing long-lost memoir. Here it is. So it's I've even framed the book as a kind of, it's a fake memoir of a real person. So already the subject is about what's real, what stories should we believe.
I loved that, and I loved reading and sort of feeling that sort of like parallel of the false narratives in terms of on the small scale of Elizabeth and the letters that she writes home, and then obviously at this sort of bloody and terrible, birth of a nation, that false narrative. And we'll talk about, I will want to get to that a bit later. So the Elizabeth that we kind of meet at the beginning is at the sort of end of her life, and she's got this bundle of documents that she's holding. And you write that, this is Elizabeth saying, my first impulse was to burn the lot. Why? Why is her impulse to get rid of all these, and then why doesn't she burn them?
She wants to get rid of them because she knows that they're going to leave behind a false impression of what her life was like. I mean, 200 years ago, women could not leave any record of what their true feelings about the world were. And yet the lives they had to lead would be unbearable to us. These women had absolutely no power over any aspect of their life. Absolutely no power. And yet, at the same time, they couldn't write down what they felt about it. Letters were public things. They were read aloud in the parlour to the friends and neighbours. Novels could only be published if they were kind of respectable and ladylike. So they were rendered silenced. They were rendered voiceless by their culture. And so it means that when you look at the things that they wrote, if you take the things that are left at face value, you will come away with a totally false idea. So that's why she wanted to burn them. For example, the portraits are one of the things. The portrait of her and her husband are one of the things, and people will look at those and say, "Oh, look what a masterful and commanding person John Macarthur looks, and look how lovely she was. What a lovely, dainty, pretty person." And she says, "Well, actually, these miniatures were painted by somebody who never saw me. Never saw me. It was done in London by a man who never saw me, from sketches, which might or might not have borne any relationship to what she actually looked like." So that's a kind of classic example of do not believe too quickly. Look at this stuff and you think, okay, I mean, this is the dilemma historians have, which I am obviously not a historian, but it's the dilemma they have. The stuff that happens to be left behind from the past is a kind of, it's not actually random. It's been carefully selected to be thought worth keeping, but it's not truly representative. It's a bit like, archaeologists find some tiny little skerrick of bone, and on the basis of that, they build a whole gigantic animal. Somebody comes along the next day with another little tiny bit of bone. They have to redraw the whole animal. So that's why she wants to burn them. Why she doesn't burn them is that she realizes that she can use them as a sort of foil against which to tell the real story. So she can say, look, here's what this says. Here's the reality. She's got double thing.
Let's go to her sort of life now. I loved reading about her childhood, and she's on the farm with her granddad, who teaches her all about sheep, which of course just immediately makes sense to anyone who's sort of familiar with the Macarthur sort of sheep empire. Can you tell us a bit about that really young time in her life, but then also how she transitions? Why she seems like she's so happy with her grandfather. And of course, there's that thing about how before puberty, essentially, girls could just be children instead of having to be young women. And I guess tell us a bit about why she has to leave that happy existence and go sort of become a lady.
Yes, she had a she had piecing together the tiny fragments about her childhood. It was pretty tough. Her father died when she was very young, and she and her mother were kind of turned out of the farm that they had been, working and living on, because the farm was entailed. People think probably to Elizabeth's cousin. So they had to go and live with Elizabeth's grandfather. But then the mother remarried, and for whatever reason, she chose not to take Elizabeth with her. Elizabeth was about 10 or 12 at this point. That would be a pretty shattering thing. Your mother marrying, going off at some distance geographically, and leaving you behind. It's like every child's nightmare. And then, of course, having another family. So she was kind of abandoned. But luckily the slack was taken up by the local clergyman, who had a daughter of Elizabeth's age, and they were obviously good friends. So she was more or less adopted into the clergyman's family, which is probably why she learnt to read and write so beautifully, because she was a very nice writer. But I thought a lot about that, and I thought, what effect would that have? You lose your father, you lose your home, you lose your mother, then you lose your grandfather. It's a series of traumatic losses which would make you strong in a way, but it would also make you very vulnerable. Mm. So when John Macarthur comes along, he's not a very pleasant person, but like a lot of, difficult, let's say, people, there's a kind of power of personality there. Mm. There's a kind of driven, look, I myself have fallen for guys like this. There's a kind of passionate, dark quality to them, which is fascinating. It is quite charismatic. So she allows herself to be drawn by her own ignorance into an event that meant that she then had to marry John Macarthur, even though I don't think either of them would have actually chosen that.
Mm. Her friend who's, who's the daughter of the pastor, Bri, it's like we get set up with this story of her and Bri. It seems like they're on track to run sort of parallel lives. They're coming of age at a similar time. They're being taught the same things about this courtship and what their roles as young wives are going to be. And there just seems to be this absolute cleaving of destinies after, what is it? Elizabeth has gone behind the hedge with John Macarthur. And on page 48, Elizabeth writes, "I ask you not to judge too harshly." This sort of indiscretion. Obviously, that she sleeps with John, has sex with John Macarthur out of wedlock. When she says, "I ask you not to judge too harshly," who is the you? It was interesting that a few times through the book, it was like Elizabeth really, rather than just writing almost for herself, she was addressing somebody in mind.
Yes, she's addressing, I think she describes some unimaginable reader of the future. Because what she's going to do with these memoirs that she's writing with shocking frankness. I mean, for a woman of the 18th century to be telling us about her sex life, her emotional life, all that stuff that women had to hide, for her to be pouring that out meant that what she did was she wrapped them up in waxed canvas, put them in a tin box sealed with wax, hid them in the roof space of her house, Elizabeth Farm. This is the joke around which the book is made. But she did hide them. She knew that someday, eventually, somebody would find them. She didn't know, of course, that it would be me. So she wanted to set the record straight. That's really why she wrote the memoirs. She wanted to say, look, I have been forced to leave behind a trail of evidence that will lead you to think that I was somebody much weaker and more namby-pamby than I really was. I want you to know who I really was. So I'm leaving these memoirs for you. Now, she could not, of course, know that at this moment in history, the idea of going behind a hedge with a person that you are attracted to is not going to shock us. Yes. She couldn't have known that. So, and part of the reason it doesn't shock us, of course, is that when we go behind the hedge now with some unsuitable person, we have probably taken precautions. so that we don't have to spend the
I
rest of
must
our
say,
lives with
reading
that
about
person.
a surprise pregnancy to a man like John Macarthur is probably one of the times I've been most grateful for birth control in the 21st century. But let's talk about him a little bit. What do we learn about him from this? I mean, this is such a catalyzing incident, the behind the hedge thing. What do we learn from him? What do we learn about him from the fact that this happens, but then also how he responds when he learns of the pregnancy?
Yeah, look, I think John Macarthur is, from reading, he has left an enormous paper trail. It's quite easy. It's quite easy to build up a pretty vivid picture of him. And unlike women's letters, men's letters were very frank. His letters to his friend Captain Piper, where he basically says to Piper, who was sent to Norfolk Island, the penal colony, basically he says, go for it with all those convict lasses. You know, it's pretty disgusting stuff. Men could leave a pretty real image of themselves behind, unlike the women. John Macarthur seems to have been driven by a need to win at all costs, basically. He would set himself one impossible goal after another. And by any means that worked, that is bullying, cajoling, coaxing, sucking up, whatever was going to work, he was determined to win. And I think we've probably all known people like that, men and women, but maybe particularly men, because I think male identity is often bound up with winning. So one of the things that he sets himself is the seduction of Elizabeth Veal, as she was then, her maiden name. And after they've been behind the hedge and the moment has happened, he no longer is full of sweet talk. Just like our fathers told us, he won't respect you. He finds that out very vividly within 5 minutes. And she realises it's a shaft of knowledge about men in general and John in particular. He had set himself this goal, but he hadn't actually expected to seduce me. That was my doing, my fault.
Is it, at least he then marries her? Is that how much of that? I'm interested. I know that would be sort of the expectation of a gentleman, but I also know that you couldn't bank on it. You know, she could have gone to him and said this has happened, and he might not have married her and done the right thing. Is there at least a sort of sliver of something in that?
Look, that's very true. I mean, we've all read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, you know, where the man was not prepared to marry her. Look, from reading the actual facts, the actual events, it looks as if somebody said to him, listen, if you marry her, at the time he was penniless. He was an ensign in the army. Ensign is the very lowest, I had to look all this up, the very lowest rank of officer. You're barely an officer, but it's the cheapest kind of commission that you could buy in those days. Now, the war had just ended, so suddenly he was on half pay. Now, an ensign on half pay was a kind of little platitude for a person who has no money. So I have a feeling that somebody got together and said, look, if you marry Elizabeth Macarthur, we will make sure that at the very least you get a position on active service. So you'll still be an ensign, but at least you'll have full pay, and possibly various other things. He wasn't a gentleman. He had the education and so on of a gentleman, but in fact his father was a draper. It's one of the many interesting things about the Macarthurs that everybody thinks they were kind of aristocratic. When I used to tell people, oh, I'm writing a book about Elizabeth Macarthur, the response very often was, oh, Lady Macarthur. And I'd say, no, she was a farmer's daughter. And John Macarthur was the son of a draper in Plymouth. So the Australian snobbery, you know, we're all people who go looking for their family history and are dying to find a duke or an earl or something. Yeah, I've forgotten where I was, but anyway, that's...
No, that's all right. I was actually, my next question was why, I guess, the sort of historical and social context of why he has this particular hang-up on being called a gentleman, because it's the source of duels and misery for Elizabeth, that it's like obviously a chip on his shoulder.
That's exactly right. A huge chip on his shoulder. The family story, whether it was a myth or not, but the family story is that the Macarthurs were actually descended from King Arthur. The original Macarthur was King Arthur himself, and that John Macarthur's grandfather had been the Laird of Argyll, which is, a big place in Scotland. So he claimed descent from aristocracy. However, of course, his fate was to be born the son of a draper, and moreover, the second son of a draper. So he didn't even inherit the business. So he had a lot of catching up to do. And I think that, plus probably a tough, I mean, I've drawn John Macarthur I've tried to set up the context in which a man might become like that. One of them is that, like most boys of his age, he was sent away at the age of 7 to boarding school. That would have been pretty tough. And while he was away at boarding school, his mother died. So those things would destroy something, I think, in a lot of little boys, little children. And one way you might respond would be to set yourself up as really needing to win, needing to be a gentleman, standing on this. His letters are full of the word honour. You have offended my honour, and therefore I'll have to have a duel with you. As Elizabeth says, he didn't know what he was worth, what his actual value was. So he had to pin his worth on this, I think she calls it the tarnished tinsel of his honour.
There was a particular scene that really gripped me or moved me, where Elizabeth's had her first child and she's breastfeeding her child, and John walks in on them breastfeeding, and do you describe that moment? And I mean, it's just so heartbreaking how he feels he's intruded, and how she has something now and he never will, or what that moment's about.
Look, I think it's a very common thing between a man and a woman who've just had a child, for the man to feel somewhat excluded from the little magic circle of the mother and the child. And so I've got a scene where he comes across, he's a fairly cold, reserved husband to Elizabeth Macarthur. So she, in turn, obviously is fairly reserved. And moreover, it's not much fun in bed with him. That must have been a great grief for those women. Most of us have had a chance to try out a few fellas, and we don't have to marry the first one. And if it doesn't work in bed, we move on. Men and women, we can move on till we find someone that part of our life kind of works with. They did not have that luxury. You were stuck with that guy forever. And if it didn't work in bed, too bad. You just had to somehow, lie back and think of England. So that's the context in which he comes into her, and she's breastfeeding the little boy, the baby. And any of us in all those little squares who have breastfed a child with love and tenderness know what a fabulous closeness that is. And he comes in and he sees on her face a kind of tenderness that he hasn't seen on it before, because he has not been able to, bring that out of her. And so he feels excluded. And for a moment she sees on his face loss, grief, sadness, a sense of exclusion. And then, of course, the water closes over that moment of weakness, and he becomes again the perfect gentleman. Oh, I do beg your pardon, madam, sort of thing, and leaves the room. So in those ways, I tried to make John Macarthur not a monster, because I don't think anyone's a monster. He was a human being who was made the way, he wasn't born that way, he was made that way.
I do want to ask, my next question is about the marital bed, because I think, one of the things this book does is just automatically makes me think of how much has changed in gender relations and what is expected from not just marriage necessarily, but coupledom. And the way John behaves towards Elizabeth, particularly in the marital bed, absolutely fits the description of what we would now call rape and marital rape. And I wondered how you decided to handle that, especially given elsewhere I remember reading that Elizabeth said that he, for example, never beat her. So we have, how do you make choices that have such monumental ramifications for how a reader will receive sort of the intention or morality of a character.
Look, one of the things I wanted to do was rescue those women of the past from the prettified version of them that we tend to see on television. You know, you think of Jane Austen's novels and you compare them to, you know, I think in all cases, the film and television versions. What they rob Jane Austen of is the savage glaze of irony in which Jane Austen is basically saying at the end of the books, where it always ends happily, basically, I think she's saying, listen, I know that this is usually not true, and you know it. This isn't it pretty to think so territory. In fact, those women's lives must have been hell. And I think we need to honour that and recognise it and not think, as the letters and the, you know, those stiff little photographs of them would suggest, that they were somehow so different from us that they didn't suffer. These were desperately oppressed human beings for whom marriage was the only possible option in their lives. It was the only career that they could have. And yet they were so constrained. You know, they would meet just a couple of men over just a very few short years. And from there, they somehow had to make a life. They had to first of all manipulate that man into asking them to marry, you know, the one they might have chosen. They had to try and make the right decision. It must have been agony. I mean, you think of that scene in Pride and Prejudice where Elizabeth Bennet's best friend has to marry a buffoon. Now, she makes a very cold-blooded, clear-eyed choice. This is her only choice of anything like a decent life with some degree of independence and a family. So we need to honour those grandmothers of ours and great-grandmothers and recognise how brilliantly so many of them did under such awful circumstances.
You've got the letters throughout the book, and they are you mentioned in the sort of afterword that the parts that are in italics are actually sort of, you know, the real letters. And I was hoping you could talk a bit about how you chose which letters to essentially sort of confirm and which ones to rebut, because they become a source of increasing, both for me as a reader, kind of hilarity. And so this irony of sometimes when you include the letter and it's just the opposite of what's happened, or just such an obvious kind of embellishment or a wink to the intended recipient of the letter, but also sometimes very sad. I mean, can you talk a bit about how you decided which letters to stay true to and which ones to sort of conflict with?
Look, it's one of the many reasons why it took me 20 years to write this book.
Fair enough.
She left a heck of a lot of letters, and a few of them have been already transcribed, although only partially. I noticed when I went back to the originals. Again, do not believe too quickly. And so I went to the State Library of New South Wales and I photographed, I think, pretty much all of them. And I then transcribed them, which was a real labour because they're quite hard to read. What struck me is how few gems there were, basically. They really are very bland letters, but now and again, the mask slips. And I'll just use two examples. One is the thing that really kept me going with this book at moments when I despaired. At one point early on, she was in the settlement at the same time as William Dawes, who was the astronomer to the settlement, about whom I've written in The Lieutenant. And she asked Dawes for some lessons in astronomy. And he gave them to her, but she discovered that, you know, astronomy is actually quite hard. She writes back to her friend, her Bri, her childhood friend. I asked for the lessons, but I mistook my abilities and I blush at my error. Now, I blush at my error doesn't sound terribly raunchy to us, but in the context of her letters, which are otherwise extremely impersonal and bloodless and kind of non-physical, in that context, to say, I blush at my error, is like this great red flag across the page. And I thought, Elizabeth Macarthur had the hots for William Dawes. Now, when I first wrote The Lieutenant, I actually put that in the book. I had Dawes Actually, I gave Dawes a girlfriend of his own, so he wasn't that interested in Elizabeth Macarthur, but I made it very clear that Elizabeth was very keen on him and made advances. I cut that out of The Lieutenant for various reasons. So what a delight to find that I could actually build the emotional heart of this new book around that thing that I had come across all those years ago and believed. And so although Elizabeth has a miserable marriage, she finds true happiness and true self-expression and self-discovery through a brief but very happy time with William Dawes. So that's one letter that just was my mantra. When I wanted to give up, I came back to that. I blush at my error. Yes, there's something there. There's a story to be told. The other one was, I think, what you might have mentioned about turning them round. Her husband, because he kept having duels and arresting governors and so on, he was sent for a total of 13 years to England. So, of course, it was she who did the sheep. He wasn't even here when the sheep happened. But on the first of his, after the first of his absences, which was about 4 years, she got word that his ship had just come into the harbour and he would soon be arriving at the house. And she writes to a friend who I think probably would have understood exactly what she meant. She said, remember that this is an awful man. She would have been so delighted to see him go. She wrote to the friend, you can imagine my feelings at the return of Mr. Macarthur. Well, yes, in the context, we most certainly can. So when you read her letters carefully, there are many more examples that I could have used, but I didn't want to load the book with too much of that. When you read them kind of inside out, as it were, you can read many of them as kind of, it's a person writing ironically in the same way Jane Austen wrote ironically. It was the only weapon they had, those women.
I loved it. For everyone watching at home, I just want to remind you, we've only got time for a couple more questions between Kate and I. And if anything has come up for you in conversation, that you can type questions for Kate into the chat window. And we're leaving 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions soon. I want to talk about the contested history of Pemulwuy and John Macarthur's role. And I thought maybe, can you tell us about the scene when essentially John has been called away after receiving a note. Elizabeth hears gunfire. John comes home, and the impression I get is that the story John tells Elizabeth is essentially the first time he kind of drafts and tries out the words he's going to use about his version of events.
Yes, that's right. One of the other reasons why the book took me 20 years to write is that I had to find a way of incorporating the fact that when the Macarthurs went to Parramatta, they were the first Europeans to steal that land from the Barramatagal, who had owned it for maybe 60,000 years. So I somehow, that was a very important, I couldn't tell that story without engaging with that fact. Now, of course, in The Secret River, I had already told a version of that story, so I couldn't tell that again. But since I was circling around a whole lot of thoughts about believing stories, I thought, okay, Elizabeth is coming to this whole dilemma about being a settler person in Australia, having taken land. She's coming to it in a different way. It's not about the actual stealing of the land. It's about the stories that her lot, the British, have told about the stealing of the land. The story they told to make it okay, basically. So in the context of that, I read about an event called the Battle of Parramatta. And there's only one contemporary account, and it's about a famous warrior called Pemulwuy leading a big group of warriors to attack the township of Parramatta, which was actually a garrison. It was one of the most heavily fortified places in the colony. Now, as most of us know, the Indigenous warriors were generally extremely clever in their tactics. And the idea that in broad daylight, across a river, they would have made a direct massed attack on men waiting there with muskets. That just struck me as kind of unlikely, to put it mildly. So I did a bit of research and I realised that there is only one version of that story, and it was told by David Collins, who wrote an account of the colony. He was actually not even in Australia at the time. He was in England. Clearly, somebody told him about it. And when I discovered the final little piece of that jigsaw was when I realised that John Macarthur was the commander at Parramatta when that event happened. And so I thought, okay, this is my chance to make a bigger statement here about what I think about the stories that we have been telling for 250 years, so that the story, you know, Elizabeth doubts the story that her husband's told her, and by implication, the story that David Collins told. And it seems to me that this is another way in which this is a story about today. We are still living in the shadows of a lot of stories that we have been telling ourselves. When I say we, I mean white Australians, that we've been sharing among each other for 250 years to justify what we did. There are all kinds of versions of them, but they should all be looked at and taken apart, because they are, well, I can only quote Elizabeth Macarthur, do not believe too quickly.
I wonder, how do you manage the risk of almost being too generous or too generous when you write someone like Elizabeth, who sort of questioned her husband's story? You know, how do you balance that when you've got a European invader and she didn't, you know, you've got the line in there, she didn't give her land back, you know, and I understand she was not necessarily in a position to be able to change John's behavior, but I mean, how do you start grappling with, you know, what Elizabeth decided was right and wrong, where she drew the line?
Yeah, look, that is difficult. I think I thought about it in terms of the dilemma that all of us non-Indigenous Australians have, whether we kind of recognise it or not, which is to say, if we recognise, as we all did at the beginning of this talk, that this always will be Aboriginal land, what do we do with the fact that we're here and we actually have nowhere to go back to, even if we might want to? There is no way back for us. So what do we do with that fact? So all I can do is give that sort of impossible situation to Elizabeth. So at the end of the book, when she's sitting in one of her rooms made of leaves by the river, a place that she has come to love, a place which she realises is home. She doesn't want to go back to England. She could have, she never did. She came to love this place. But what does it mean to love a place that you've stolen? And she recognises that that is a kind of impossible situation. And she says, all I can do is admit that I am a thief. And I have been a thief for every one of the days that I've been here, but I'm not prepared to give back that land. And she says, that's the situation that I'm in. And I'm speaking there for the present day people like myself. It seems to me each of us has to come to that situation in a different way and arrive at a different kind of accommodation. But it is it's kind of unsolvable. And I've given that unsolvability to her. So I haven't, I hope, let her off the hook. It's just that she has come far enough to say, okay, I'm prepared to look in the eye what I have done, she says, not pretend that it doesn't exist or that it's okay.
Which is what Australia currently does on a national scale.
That's right. And as she says, I know that acknowledging it does not remove one jot of the sorrow and the horror of it. I know that me being aware of it and looking it in the eye and everything, what good does that do? But it's at least the first step. And that seems to me an honourable first step. I don't know what you do beyond that.
Chrissy, I have a billion more questions, but I can see that there are some from the audience, so I'll give everybody else a go.
We've got a few questions about the title of the book, actually, and if you could explain the title, we might start with that.
Yes, thanks. That's a really good question. There are 2 rooms made of leaves in the book, and when I decided not to call it do not believe too quickly, which did sound a little bit kind of schoolmarmy. It was a little bit the wagging finger, do not believe too quickly. Then I had to think of something else. The two rooms made of leaves, one of them is the place she shares with William Dawes. And it's in that place, and the room made of leaves, it's a little clearing in the bushes, basically. But it's there that she suddenly recognises the beauty of this place. Like a lot of British people, it took her a while to recognise and value this place as not just a sort of second-hand England, but a beautiful place of its own. So the first room made of leaves is her great happiness with William Dawes and all the things she learns from him. Because the other thing she learns from him, he, of course, is learning the Gadigal language from the Gadigal people who visit him. And through him, she meets those people. She learns a whole lot of stuff. She is humbled by their shrewdness and their humour. So she engages in a respectful and kind of, a respectful way with the whole notion of the Indigenous people there. So her first moment in the room made of leaves is a moment of learning and delight. The second one is at the end of her life when she's sitting by the Parramatta River in another beautiful little clearing among the bushes. And that's the moment where she says, I now know that this room made of leaves is beautiful and it is home to me. There is nowhere else I want to be or can be, but at the same time, it is not mine. It is not my little corner of mine. It actually, I have stolen it.
That's and it's a very poetic title as well. So I think that's a wonderful thing that it's so poetic. Mad has asked, a number of your novels are about rewriting the narrative of oppressed peoples or groups, Indigenous Australia, women. Have you felt this as a project, or has it been more of a serendipitous, accidental thing for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. Perhaps neither of those. It's a kind of urgent need for myself to work through a puzzle. I mean, as a descendant of, convict person who came out here in 1806, I seem to be, it is a dilemma. It is a real dilemma to be descended from settlers who stole land. So what do you do with that? So all my books seem to be circling, all the recent ones anyway, seem to be circling around that. I didn't set myself a conscious project. The Secret River is where it began, of course, and that came out of the Walk for Reconciliation that I did back in 2000, when I suddenly realised that I needed to know stuff that I had been brushing under the carpet, like so many other people, for so long. I needed to dig that stuff out and have a proper look at it and see exactly what had happened. And from there, one book seems to have led to another. Each one keeps, you answer one question and another is waiting to be asked beyond it.
Fair enough. Darry has asked, from inception to publication, it took 20 years for this book to emerge, but the actual writing of the manuscript, was that a more concise project?
Yes, it was. The difficulties were kind of conceptual. So I did a huge amount of research. I mean, I might add that I wrote, 5 books over that same 20 years, 5 other books. So I wasn't sitting on my hands. I would come back to it because sometimes I'd go back to the letters of Elizabeth Macarthur and I'd think, I can't do anything with this. This is too hard. I can't imagine my way in to this world. And do I want to? Do I like this woman? So I would give up from time to time. And finally, when I first moved to Melbourne, which is about 3 years ago, I thought, look, let's give it a go. I've either got to write this book or abandon it because it's kind of been haunting me now for 20 years. So I remember sitting in my little front room with the hot water, in bed with the hot water bottle at my feet, thinking, okay, just cover 5 pages every day with writing. And at the end of a month, you will be able to see whether you've got something or not. So it probably took 3 or 4 years, the actual writing.
You're talking about diving into your ancestors has really has unleashed a lot of people's thoughts about their own kind of histories. So there's lots of comments coming in about that. It's obviously something that we need to think about and tackle. So that's really great. But I will ask you this question that has come through, which is, can you tell us more about the letters hidden in candle wax? Are these her actual letters or actual memories?
Yes. Well, this is where the sort of Russian doll aspect of the book comes up. There are real letters from Elizabeth Macarthur, which are in the State Library of New South Wales, and I do quote little bits from those actual real letters of the real woman, Elizabeth Macarthur, but I've kind of embedded those in a memoir, which is completely fictional. At the beginning of the book, I've got a little preface from myself as editor saying, I just found these and all I'm doing is bringing them to the world. I don't really expect people to believe that. Again, irony is strongly at work, but, you know, there may be some people who will take that seriously. Just in case, at the end of the book, I've got a little bookend in which I say, look, actually, you know, I didn't discover this memoir, I just wrote it. So I had a lot of fun playing with levels of truth and fiction and where the two weave in and out of each other.
Look, there is some, I'm just scrolling through so many comments, which I will try and send to you, Kate, because there's so many thank yous for this book, and so many people are saying you're expressing how I feel, and it's great to have somebody who's talking about things that I'm thinking of as well, which is really fantastic. But someone has also mentioned that they haven't read the book yet, but was interested that the Macarthurs had opinions about the convict women who were coming over on the ship with them. And sorry, I've just scrolled past it, so I'm trying to find this. And that it was the death ship. And do you know about this kind of part of their history, their journey here, and their relationship to convict women and what they thought about that?
Yes, Elizabeth Macarthur wrote a journal, so-called journal, of that voyage, or at least the first part of it, in which she talks about they were in a cabin which was separated from the convict women by only a very thin partition through which I think they could hear everything. Now, she's been accused of not showing any sympathy to those convict women, which I think is a bit unfair. Who knows what she thought? The journal was not the outpourings of her private thoughts. The journal was clearly written for some kind of public audience. So the fact that she doesn't express huge sympathy for those women, I think it's a bit unfair to take her at face value there. So I have in fact given her, as I think she would have felt, sympathy for those sisters on the other side of the partition. She was not a lady. She was a farmer's daughter. She had become pregnant out of wedlock, and Bri, as you say, she may well have not ended up with a marriage. You know, she might have had to deal with having a child out of wedlock, which at that time would have been completely disastrous. So it would be very likely, I thought, that she would in fact have a lot of sympathy for those women. Her husband certainly didn't. He's on record, on historical record, as having made some extremely insulting comment about at least one of them, who then later married James Roos, who was one of the first farmers in Sydney. Long story there. So I think, you know, you always have to take it with a pinch of salt. She has been accused of being unsympathetic. I think that's a bit I think it's leaping to conclusions.
Yeah. Look, we are running out of time. We do have a couple more questions that have just come in, but I think that we will need to wrap it up there. So if Bri, sorry, my cat has joined the meetings. It's time to finish. So Bri, if you have any final kind of closing comments, and same with Kate, then we'll open it up to the floor to clap. Can you? Yeah.
Oh, I just want to say a big thank you. I so loved this book. For anyone who hasn't read it yet, one thing I sort of didn't get the chance to ask Kate about was just the incredible sort of psychological portrait we get of Elizabeth, and how she you know, you've heard Kate speak about the tricky situation these women were in, where the marriage was the sort of one chance they had to have any control over the trajectory of their lives, and essentially that Elizabeth also had that taken from her. And the next several decades of her life of kind of managing this manic, almost unbearable husband, and just the beautiful insight we get into Elizabeth over the course of a lifetime. I mean, it's incredibly done, and I just love this book, and it's just been such a joy to hear from you, Kate. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Bri, because you've opened up all the things that I want to talk about, all the issues. Elizabeth Macarthur as an amazing character. She must have been a remarkable woman, but also the bigger ideas that are relevant to today. So thank you so much for your generosity in opening that up. And congratulations on Eggshell Skull, which I recently read, and I really recommend all of you should have a read of that if you haven't already. And thank you, Chrissy, for, you know, and to Avid Reader, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share the book with you.
Thanks, Kate. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear this conversation. Absolutely fantastic. And we all look forward to reading the book, which I have sent the link so you can purchase that and remember you get a discount if you write the word event at the checkout. It's been really, really fantastic. This has been a highlight of this year. Lucky we're in COVID world because we all get to sit at home and listen to you. That's the only good thing about it. I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves now. So if you want to unmute yourself and give Kate a round of applause, we're going to do that. And thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Kate.
Thank you, Bri.
See you.
Thank you,
Kate.
Hey.
Thank